Well, June 25th of this last year was my annual pastor's report, and I shared several concepts, and I talked about some of them last week. We talked about Matthew chapter 13, where the merchant is on lookout for choice pearls. And when he finds one of great value, he sells everything and buys the pearl. And the point of that is that Jesus wants to transform us into a pearl. Jesus is the merchant on the lookout for choice pearls. You and I are a pearl, but yet we haven't become a pearl yet. Instead, we are the threat, the parasite, the object in which the oyster has transformed into the pearl. And Jesus can see us as the pearl while we are still a threat, while we're still not part of the kingdom of heaven. And he wants to transform us and do powerful things in us. But the other side of that, if you remember, the challenge was, are you a pebble, which is being transformed into a pearl, or are you a pig, which we come to in Matthew chapter 7. And Jesus talks to us about some practical things. Now, I say practical things. I remember growing up, there were certain things movies would portray that I thought were common threats that I would have to figure out how to navigate. Probably the most popular one that people talk about is quicksand. I have never encountered quicksand in my life. But you remember the movies from the 80s and 90s, quicksand was a common occurrence. Now, maybe there are areas in the world where quicksand is something people really have to be worried about, not around where I've ever lived. Another thing, and maybe this is because I grew up at a time where the movie The Lion King was a big deal, but another thing that movies seem to portray on a somewhat frequent basis were the danger of stampedes. Now, if you've raised cattle, you probably there should be some danger there. But I've never known anybody to have been in a dangerous position because of a stampede. And I guess I should have asked some of the farmers in here if you've ever had those issues before. But the reality is that's not something, unless you put yourself in that position, that you really have to worry about too much, unless you're dealing with big livestock. And so as I was thinking about these things, the concept of stampede and trampling came to mind, because that's what Jesus is talking about here when we get into Matthew chapter 7, of trampling, of getting in the way, of destroying. And so he starts in Matthew chapter 7 in verse 1, and he says, "Do not judge, and you will not be judged. You will be treated in the same way you treat others. The standard you use in judging is the same standard in which you will be judged." Now, when Jesus is talking about not judging, he is presenting it in the negative connotation. When you say, if somebody says, "You are judging me," it's not a compliment. We don't judge people in complimentary ways. Now, sometimes we get into semantics here, and how do we define the word judge, and how is it different from observation or accountability or rebuke? And those things are all connected, but what Jesus is talking about here is judgment that is condemning. If all you're doing is judging someone to condemn them, there's no productive purpose. So there's some self-righteousness that is embedded in what Jesus is saying here. Because if I judge you in a condemning way, all I'm doing is trying to make you feel bad or put you in your place. And so what I'm doing is I'm focusing on your insufficiencies, your faults, your failures, and ignoring my own deficiencies. I'm highlighting yours so I can hide mine. Now, this is probably one of the most common passages, verses, that gets distorted by non-Christians. Non-Christians will say, "Well, you're not supposed to judge. The Bible says so. Don't judge." And they're right. The Bible says don't judge. And we recognize that there's no point for a follower of Jesus to judge a non-follower of Jesus for not following Jesus. There's no point in that. Everyone would agree with that. That if I have chosen to live in this standard, not the standard of Jesus, a standard contrary to Jesus, judging me by the standard of Jesus doesn't make any sense. But from the standpoint of if we're all following Jesus, there's a difference between judging and accountability. There's a difference between what does it mean to judge someone and what does it mean to keep someone accountable. And the reality is, noticing someone's sin isn't the point. If all you do is notice someone's faults, failures, there's no productive purpose for that. If you just sit back and watch somebody not be what you think they should be, that's not what we're called to do. So accountability is different than judging. It's different than just acknowledging or identifying what somebody is doing wrong. It's actually helping someone follow Jesus. You know, we recognize we're called to love each other, and this New Testament word agape means unconquerable benevolence, that you want the best for someone. You can't judge somebody with agape, but you can hold them accountable with agape. See, judging is this, I'm just condemning you. Accountability, rebuke, is helping someone get closer to Jesus. Now, the world doesn't like this. The world doesn't want to be held accountable. The world doesn't like conviction. Now, sometimes the world contradicts itself, and it cancels somebody. Somebody makes a mistake, and maybe it's a colossal mistake, and they just erase them like they don't exist anymore, and they get fired from everything, and maybe they should, but only in those extreme instances does the world actually have any level of accountability. Because instead of accountability, the world wants affirmation. The world wants everyone to say what you're doing is not just tolerable, but that it's good. If that's what you want to do, the world's saying, yeah, that's good. You do what you want to do. As long as what you want to do, we're okay with that. But from a faith standpoint, accountability goes both ways. We must live by a standard and hold others to the same standard. Now, if we're being honest, many can give rebuke, but few can accept rebuke. And what I always find interesting when I think about this is kids are taught to accept rebuke. You think of when you were growing up in school, you would get graded all the time, and you get told how many things you got wrong. You would get told, you're doing this wrong, you need to prove here, you need to do this better. But then as we get older, we don't like that anymore. And maybe there's a point where it starts to go down the other side, but I've found the older I get, the less I like rebuke. Now, if you've gotten to a point where you like it a lot more, please tell me, because then it'll give me hope. But the reality is, we don't like it. Nobody does. But see, instead of what we do is we highlight somebody else's problems so we can hide our own. That's the game that we tend to play. And so Jesus identifies this as he continues in verse 3. He says, and why worry about the speck in your friend's eye when you have a log in your own eye? How can you say to your friend, let me help you with your speck when you have a log in your own eye? Hypocrite, first deal with the log in your own eye, and then you'll see well enough to help your friend with his speck. Now, as Jesus is talking here, I'm not sure if this is necessarily his point, but he's talking about the speck in your friend's eye, which to me, what it says is even the person who looks like everything together, is doing everything right, if you look hard enough, you can find faults. You can find something wrong with that individual. And so the speck not just represents the fact that somebody has something wrong, but that everybody has something if you look hard enough. See, no one is above sin. No one is above temptation. No one is above all those things. Now, we recognize that we can be free through the power of Jesus, but that doesn't mean we're above it. We still recognize that Satan has power, and we shouldn't be ignorant or arrogant towards the power of Satan. That we have to remain humble in our pursuit of Jesus. Even if there are small things, we all have small things we need to work on. Because no matter how close you are to Jesus, you can get closer. No matter how much of Jesus you have, you can still have more Jesus. You never get to a point where you stop. I mean, in Church of Nazarene, we got the saying, we're saved, sanctified, and petrified, right? Yeah, I'm glad some of you are shaking your heads. You get the sentiment, though. And sometimes we get to a point where it's real easy to stop growing. See, the alternative to being humble is being arrogant. If I think that I've arrived spiritually with Jesus, That's a pretty dangerous place to be. Because we all have problems. And Jesus says, you may see a small thing in somebody else, but all you're doing is trying to hide the big thing in your own life. So it says the log in your own eye, the thing that is your fault, your failure, your deficiencies, your struggles. Because each and every one of you, you know that you are not perfect. Unless you're extremely narcissist, you know you're not perfect. You're not. And so if we all come to the table recognizing that we're not perfect, we can have some type of conversation about this, because pretending you're perfect fools no one. And I love the Matthew West song, Truth Be Told. It says, I'm fine, but I'm not, I'm broken. Right? Everybody else's life is perfect except mine. No. We all have faults and flaws. And what we need to do first and foremost is to worry about our faults and our flaws. Because when I worry about your insufficiencies, when I worry about your faults and your failures, what I'm doing is I'm trying to ignore mine, trying to cover mine, and make it so mine aren't noticeable. Now, there's this concept called the fundamental attribution error. And this concept was really intriguing when I came across it, because essentially what it does is it excuses my behavior or my actions, but not yours. And so let's use a trivial example. If you have a coworker and that coworker shows up late for work, and let's say traffic was a problem, or the line at the coffee shop was longer than normal, and they're 10 or 15 minutes late, you'll judge them. The tendency is for you to judge them for being late, for not being responsible enough, for not making enough margin in their schedule to get there on time. But if you walk in 10, 15 minutes late because traffic was bad, or the line at the coffee shop was longer than normal, well, that was a circumstance that you couldn't see coming, and you give yourself grace for that. And that is our tendency. Now, there are some cases, extreme cases, that, if there's an illness or a major accident or something that is known to cause congestion, if there's those types of things, we'll give grace. But on a general day-to-day basis, I excuse my behavior, but I don't excuse yours. See, for mine, since those are circumstances outside of my control, or that is a one-time thing, or that's not who I am. If it's you, it's because you're lazy. It's because you're irresponsible. It's because you didn't plan properly. See, that's what we tend to do as people. And I want to challenge you to think about that. Next time somebody gives you an excuse like that, if they're late or something happens like that, say, are you giving them grace, or are you saying, man, you should have done better? Think about it. I want to challenge you to do that, because we give excuses for ourselves but not for others. And so what it does is highlighting someone else's faults hides mine. Now we know, or at least we would say, that we need the support from each other. But before we can properly support each other, we need to submit to Jesus. Because we're not just a support group. That is not the full extent of what the church is called to be. We're called to support each other. And if I've got a log in my own eye and I'm trying to help someone with a speck in their eye, then it's hypocrisy. And Jesus calls it what it is. It says that we are ignoring our problems, and it's easy to be pretty self-righteous. Well, you got a problem. It may be small. Whether I recognize that it's small or not, if I highlight that problem, if I highlight the problem in you, then I can ignore mine. See, there's a practical reason of what Jesus is talking about here, too. And in fact, I'll give credit. Rob, I was talking to you about this a few months ago. And Rob indicated that, you know what Jesus is talking about here? That helping someone with sin is delicate work. It's precise work. That if you can't see clearly, you're going to mess it up. You're going to cause more problems, likely. I mean, if you think about it, If you're in for surgery and your surgeon can't see well, that's not good. You're going to want a different surgeon, without question. But if I try to help somebody with their problems, with their sin, and I've got a log in my own eye, I'm not going to be able to see clearly enough to actually help them. Now, Jesus is not saying we got to be perfect. He's not saying we have to have it all figured out. I think it's interesting to consider the organization Alcoholics Anonymous. Every person who goes through that program has a sponsor. And at least most, if not all cases, the sponsor also is an addict. And so the sponsor is on this journey too, helping this individual. But see, what the sponsor has recognized is the sponsor has already recognized their brokenness. So they can help others because they are broken. And they've come to terms with it. They have acknowledged it. They have identified at least some of their temptations, some of their personal struggles. But see, what tends to happen in the church is we try to act like we have it all figured out, then I'm going to go help somebody else. Almost like it's a charity case. See, Alcoholics Anonymous, it's not a charity case. The sponsor realizes that they can slip up too, that they are still an addict. The sponsor never graduates from being an addict. Even if they've been dry for 10 years, they still identify themselves as addicts. So what would it look like if followers of Jesus identified themselves as sinners saved by the grace of Jesus Christ so that we can help other people who are sinners saved by the grace of Jesus Christ? What if that was our mentality? Instead of focusing on your faults, your flaws, your sin, so that I can hide mine, what if we had this shared brokenness? What if we did that? Wouldn't the church be a lot different place if that happened? See, the point is not that we have to have it all figured out. Jesus is not saying the log in your eye is because only when you get it all figured out can you actually help somebody else. But that until you come broken, until Jesus begins to remove that log, until you actually have this mutual brokenness together, you're not going to be able to help the other person. But he concludes the section by saying, don't waste what is holy on people who are unholy. Don't throw pearls to pigs. They will trample them, then turn and attack you. And if you think about this, it makes sense from a practical standpoint. The word holy can be defined as pure or set apart. So if it's something pure, you're not going to combine it with something that is impure, whatever that may be. I mean, you can think of things like cooking ingredients, or you can think of just things around the house that you're not going to combine the clean laundry and the dirty laundry in the same basket. That's going to make you feel like you have to wash every piece of clothing again. Now, one of the great things of our faith is that Jesus is fully righteous, fully holy, completely pure, and he can interact with us without being contaminated himself. Think of the leper that reached out and touched him. According to Jewish law, Jesus should have been unclean for 7 days and have to go through ceremonial washing, but the unclean was able to touch Jesus in a way that did not contaminate Jesus, but that just purified the unclean. So Jesus is different than us. But we recognize we're not going to take what is holy and contaminate it with that which is unholy. Right? From a logical standpoint, it makes perfect sense. And so why I want to make that clear is Jesus is calling us to serve, not just to be abused. See, sometimes we can be in difficult situations that you could be classified as abuse. If people say, you got to stay there, you got to stick it out, keep fighting. Well, that's not what Jesus is telling us to do. There may be times we should do that. In fact, following Jesus is not limited to having life be all cushy and good. That's not the point of following Jesus. Sometimes we have to suffer. In fact, sometimes we have to be thankful that we were counted worthy to suffer for the gospel. But there's a difference between Jesus calling us to serve and to stay and to persevere, and there's a difference between being abused. So Jesus is not saying that we have to continually subject ourselves to being hurt. Now, sometimes we need to persevere. I'm not giving us an out necessarily, but to say that the point what Jesus is making is not so that we just continually get hurt. He's saying don't waste our time with those who are working against Jesus. And so pearls are valuable. As Jesus said, don't throw pearls to pigs. We recognize that they're valuable, and in Jesus' day, there was really no cultivation process. That just had to find an oyster in the wild and see if it had a pearl in it. Most don't, but if you found one, it had value. Now today we have a cultivation process that helps us to have more pearls, bigger pearls, often better pearls than what you will find in the wild, but they didn't have that in Jesus' day, and so pearls were very rare and as such had immense value. But one of the things about pearls that's really interesting is that pearls are unique. There's nothing about pearls that is manufactured when you consider a wild pearl. Now, you can grind it down, you can smooth it out, you can buff it, you can do all those things. But if you compare something like a pearl to that of precious metal like gold or silver, you can find gold and silver, melt them down, and make whatever object you want out of those things. When you find a pearl is what you get. You can shape it a little bit, but you can't reform it. You can't melt it down and do whatever you want with it. A pearl is a pearl. It's what you get, and part of that is the beauty of it. That you can't make it perfect from a human standpoint. But on the other hand, pigs are unclean from a Jewish perspective. Now, some of you have raised pigs in the past, or hogs, and I believe I've heard the smell of pigs is money. But the fact of the matter is, from a Jewish standpoint, in Jesus' day, pigs were considered unclean. See, no Jew would buy, sell, or eat pigs if they were following the law. And so they just avoided them. So Jesus is using this known animal that is known by all to be considered unclean, that the Jews would stay away from. And one of the things about pigs, and I think it's interesting that Jesus uses pigs specifically, is that pigs are very intelligent, and when they get bored, they can be real troublesome. That if you don't have them properly secured, they're going to find a way out. They're going to find a way to cause destruction. Because they're pretty intelligent. I believe in at least the top 10, if not top 5, of intelligence in regards to animals. And when they get out, they're going to entertain themselves, cause problems, wreak havoc, and be destructive. So we see that Jesus is saying that his work and the life of the individual is like a pearl. It's priceless. Sin's work in the life of the individual is like a pig. It's destructive. It takes what is holy, it contaminates it, it devours it. And so Jesus, in part, is saying that we need to guard against those who seek to trample Jesus' work in our life. But we have to be real careful how this is decided, because we can become real jaded. We can come on a crusade real fast, real easily, if we aren't careful. And so this is where I think we come back to focusing on someone else's insufficiencies. It ignores my deficiencies. If I focus on your problems, I'm highlighting your problems, is to hide mine. Because the reality is, we all have pig tendencies. And there's a layer of Jesus where he's asking us, or telling us, encouraging us to guard against those who work against the work of Jesus. He's telling us that. But I also think there's a layer of what Jesus is telling us is, what's the plank in your eye? What are your pig tendencies? Because you can go on a crusade, fight against all other sorts of people. Jesus saying, you can do that. Jesus is not giving you permission to do that. That's not what I was meaning. But you are able to do that. But I think the bigger question is, how am I like the pig? How am I the one working against Jesus? Because you may have been hurt. And often, you've probably been hurt by pigs. And maybe you're hurting now because of a pig. I'm sorry. I am. And those things are really hard to deal with. My point is not to excuse the pig's behavior. And maybe we need a series or sermon on how to heal from that. But today I want to challenge you, don't focus on the other person. Focus on you. What are the faults in your life? What are the things in your life that Jesus needs to continue to work on? Because we all have them. We all have things that try to pull us away from Jesus. And for whatever reason, I decided I just wrote down some common sins: anger, envy, laziness, pride, fear, apathy, gossip, comfort, worrying, lying, sexual immorality, pornography, selfishness, hatred, judgment, cheating, stealing, dishonoring your parents, not raising your children to Christ, neglecting gathering together, idolatry, which means putting anything above Jesus or using the Lord's name in vain. They're just a few. They're just off the top of my head that we tend to struggle with. But what if we spent time pondering the question, what are my deficiencies? What are my faults and flaws? Not in a way that's degrading to us, but a way that's saying, Jesus, what do I need to remove from my life? Before I worry about anybody else, how do I make sure I get my life where it needs to be? Because if we just ignore that question, pretend like that question's not pertinent to our life, that's pig behavior. That is behavior that's contrary to the work of Jesus Christ in your life. It's arrogance and ignorance saying, well, I got it figured out. I don't need to ask that question. I don't have anything in my life that is a shortcoming or fault or failure. But if we do, Jesus is going to meet us where we are. And he's going to say, I'm so glad you came to me. I see your faults and your flaws. And just like that pearl, he wants to cover you with grace and more grace and more grace and more grace. Jesus doesn't see your faults and condemn you. He sees your fault and says, let me help you. Let me transform you. Let me shape you. And I was thinking about what would happen if we allowed Jesus into our lives so richly, so deeply, in such an all-consuming manner that we were transformed and our pig tendencies were pushed out more and more and more. Wouldn't that be beautiful? But the only way we can get to that beauty is if we come to Jesus. We can't get that beauty. We can't get that transformation by just saying amen and feeling good about ourselves. We can only get that transformation by coming to Jesus and saying, please shape me.